Alrighty, hello every folks, and good morning. So, you ever have one of those moments where you kind of had a realization months down the road that you should have figured out months ago? You just end up kicking yourself upside the head over and over and over, you know what? This would have been so freaking easy to explain ages ago before it became a rumor. So, one of the things that has been around as a bit of a rumor since Reborn came out was over the resistances, debuffs, and all of that kind of thing. Namely, the fact that when you're going and using debuffs yourself, you're able to use them just fine, but the AI will refuse to use them. And additionally, you only have 2 resist skills. Obviously, it's a little bit of a meme that you have only 2 resists that you can use. And for months, like, I feel really bad for whoever was receiving customer service emails, because I've been even including that in the emails as just a bit of an extra over, like, hey, the AI isn't using debuffs over and over and over, when it is... Thinking back on it, it's really obvious and provable that this was a direct design decision. Okay, so let's go ahead and address a few things real quick. As far as we're going to approach this from the perspective of the things that folks would complain about back in the PSP version, as well as the stuff that's provable in Reborn here. So, for one thing, this is what I'm talking about right here, where there's going to be a lot of very specific resistances, which basically function similarly to they're kind of a reworked version of how they worked back in PSP. So, like, in PSP, you basically got a 5% resistance drop per rank for every one of these resistances, and this was a skill that absolutely no one frickin' used. And then you had the proofs that were on top of that, which were a 10,000 point to unlock skill. They were the most expensive thing in the game that basically made you immune to that thing. Now, the main purpose of the resists from a strategic standpoint was that you wanted a unit not to get hit with that debuff and just redirect it somewhere else. So usually you would put a resistance on one in order to redirect it to somebody that had a proof, so that basically you were just kind of nullifying the thing outright. Now, I say usually. Realistically, again, practically nobody ever used these. You got a resistance bonus off your basic shields, and then you got a proof on your upgraded shields. And basically the endgame meta for PSP was just stacking as many proofs as you can on top of a unit that could break armor, which basically meant that debuffs didn't really exist by the time you got to the endpoint there. Like, you could still get hit by stuff like Breach, still get stuff by Weaken, or hit by stuff like Weaken, but typically, like, Stun, Sleep, Shackle, all of that kind of stuff, like, Stop Proof and Stone Proof were kind of just expected to be on many of the units you expected to rely on. So, anyway, let's go ahead and talk about that real quick. So, one of the big annoyances that people had in that version was the constant debuff spam. So we're talking about cases where new players pretty regularly for years had dropped comments on videos over stuff like, well, this is RNG bullshit, I keep getting hit by Paralytic Wave, or I walked into a fight and, like, can you explain why I can't do XYZ in this situation, and then they send a screenshot and it's like a unit hit with like 5 debuffs at once, and it's like, okay, so they're not countering because they're stunned, they're over here not able to recruit stuff because they're silenced, but then over here they're not able to recruit that other guy because he's hit by stop. Like, it was just this whole thing of trying to explain every single one of these, but they started a fight and got hit just with tons of debuffs at once. Now, the system in general in PSP was kind of it was basically there in terms of just kind of giving you that feel of a overwhelming amount of, stuff just kind of flooding over your units, which is all well and good, and this is something that the One Vision mod ended up leaning into. For Reborn, the focus was more on flow. So how exactly do you kind of upgrade the flow of the fights while still retaining those debuffs? How exactly do you improve the situation where the player can still use the debuffs for creative things? The AI isn't spamming it constantly, because for those that missed PSP, when I say spamming constantly, I mean Terror Knights would basically sit there, not bother attacking you most of the time, and just Paralytic Wave, Paralytic Wave, Paralytic Wave, Paralytic Wave. The ghosts were over there spamming Lodestone over and over. Like, you were being hit by accuracy and whatever else debuffs non-stop. So usually slow plus extra slow plus stop plus stun plus, like, you were just getting bombarded non-stop. And look, again, it depends on the situation. Like, in the PSP system of things, this basically was frustrating for new players, and then for folks that had been around a while, you basically just got into this mindset of, okay, you know what, I've got my stun proof on my units, I've got my Azure necklace right here, I just go send Denim over nearby those Terranites, okay, he is now a lightning rod to all those paralytic waves, and then everybody else can just kind of go about their business. All of your frontline fighters, you know, you put the SPs on there, you get their sleep proof, oh, you know, someone's going to be fighting some fairies, you give them their tower shield. Like, you basically started memorizing the proofs on your items to the point that the debuffs didn't exist anymore. You know, barring a few of them. Obviously, stuff like Breach and whatnot were not something that you could become immune to. Anyway, so, with that all being said, let's go ahead and observe what they did in Reborn here. So, I've said for a while that it certainly felt like monsters were the sort of new source of debuffs, as it were. Like, for example, the Cyclops previously was just sort of a meaty thing that casted stuff at you, all well and good. You know, you'd get some debuffs off their palms and stuff. But typically something like Howl didn't necessarily come up that often. However, now it's one of those big predictable forms like, hey, we're going to get a bunch of stun coming in from that thing. Or, for example, if we go ahead and observe this party right here, here, let's go ahead and remove you real quick. Look over these guys. It's like, you know that, okay, there's a fire dragon that's going to be dropping some weaken on you. You're going to be getting fall strike from the lightning dragon. You're going to be getting your breach from the water dragon, you know, poison from these guys. You see some birds, you're going to be getting stunned. Basically, griffins and cockatrices are more or less what the Terranites were back in PSP, except very big, like, you know, big obvious telegraphed, hey, look, guys, you're going to be hit by this crap kind of moment. And same thing for petrification. And I know it sounds on paper like it would be more strategic to see the AI come in and spam those debuffs, but you have to understand the whole idea of using the resistances and using the debuffs back in PSP, it's not as strategic as it sounds. It basically was a case of you either knew it ahead of time and you made it not exist, or you came into a situation where, like, let's say the Nibith fight was particularly, or not the Nibith fight, the Cresta fight was particularly notorious for those situations where you would get her back up on her feet, everybody's petrified, everybody's slowed, it's just a shitty time. Like, it's hard to describe that experience where you just had a really good plan come together, and then, like, two ghosts came up, and then just, like, you forgot to cover a weakness against some oddly specific debuff that ghost that looks the same as all the other ghosts over there decided to bring along with them, and now everything's gone completely to crap. Now, on paper, it sounds like, okay, you'll carry more debuff, or you'll carry more backup plans for it. But then, what exactly are your backup plans in that situation? Okay, you've got your clerics. They're over here, you know, on the other end of the map. They don't have any range extension. They can't exactly reach that. Or, for example, you're going to go use your items. Okay, all well and good, except that Petrifog just petrified all of your item users at once. It was a case where, if you knew about them, you could completely nullify them. A lot of the player side units that were doing this basically just had pretty crappy hit odds because they didn't know how Spell Strike worked, because oftentimes folks would be first experiencing, you know, like missile spells and splashes and stuff, which aren't missing. And so they're thinking, like, oh, Spell Strike is only for the missiles to hit, and then the debuff odds are just kind of their own thing, because a lot of RPGs will, you know, do that kind of stuff. So, like, the debuffs, like, their debuffs aren't necessarily hitting. They might have completely forgotten Spell Strike exists. This is why, for example, for your debuff casters this time around, you just have concentration, where they're coming in with a locked-in minimum percentage for this to hit. But what this has kind of created, like, the way that it all kind of comes together here, is that you now have a more predictable thing in terms of, like, okay, the ninjas are going to be dropping their variety of debuffs. This is actually far more fun than it used to be before, since the old PSP version was basically they come in, they drop a Shadow Bind on you. If you get that unlucky 10%, congratulations, that unit's out of the fight for a little bit because you probably didn't bring along ease, because getting rid of Bind, Shackle, and Stop were a bit prohibitively expensive compared to some of the other ones, because you needed to have upgraded Field Alchemy, which you may not have on all of your units. You can kind of see where this was getting a bit overcomplicated in terms of, like, did you prepare for this problem way ahead of time? Maybe. If you didn't, sucks. If you did, well, you may have missed out on something else. Like, there was a lot of preparing for weirdly specific situations, but this tended to lead to a lot of resets for new players, and tended to lead to a lot of, did I remember to do X, Y, or Z specific thing on the for the veteran players and what have you. And it felt real shitty to go through a map for the 100th time and then realize you forgot to, you forgot one specific debuff, and it's just going to be a pain in the ass now. Anyway, so, like, now you know you're getting your stun, silence, poison off your your ninjas. Now you know that, like, oh, there's a beast unit over there. I'm going to be hit by breach from the octopus. I'm going to be hit by false strike from the octopus. I'm going to be seeing some stuns, maybe some stops, maybe some spoil heals from these guys. I mean, granted, spoil heal doesn't come up that often, but you get what I'm getting at. You're probably expecting to see some silences coming out of your juggernauts and things like that. It just gives you a more predictable way to see all of these things, you know? Like a lot of these things, again, like threaten, check, intimidate, stuff like that. These rarely came up in PSP. They were so rare that in many cases, I mean, I've seen several comments over the years over like, oh, this, you know, how dare they have this bullshit skill? And then the player uses it because the AI came in, they had it ranked up at like rank 4 or something, so they're looking at 50, you know, they're looking at pretty much a coin flip when they're using it. The player goes to use it and it's like, oh, it's 30% hit odds. I hope you're happy with that. And then like you have to spend the TP to get the skill to activate. You have to spend the time to activate the skill. And then it just misses over and over, and it's like, you've just wasted your TP. Why would you bother with this when you could just have them hit instead? So this led to so many skills that were just straight up not being used. But anyway, so they changed it. So yeah, there's minimum hit odds on debuffs. These guys with their guaranteed debuff hits suddenly matter, you know, a lot more in this context. These guys with their speed and range and everything else are basically still hitting the same way with those paralytic waves and stuff, or rather still hitting with their stun breaths and whatnot. They're still hitting AoEs on stuns, but it's more obvious. You don't need to go to like, okay, hold on, there's wizard guy over there. What spell books did he bring along? Okay, oh shoot, then there's this one over here. What did they bring along? Oh, okay, that's kind of okay. What did this one bring along? Like, you don't have to go through the menus to know what they are. It's like, oh, you know, there is Gremlin, he's gonna poison something. There is Fairy, they're gonna charm something. There is Pumpkin, they're gonna exercise something. Like, it's more telegraphed. In terms of a design decision, it's not the same as the PSP version, but this is better in a design front in terms of informing the player what they're running into. So in terms of the oddly specific resistances and stuff like that, I feel like this time around, I want to say it's 30%. I don't know if anyone's actually dug into... I feel like somebody must have dug into what the resists do, but it might be too oddly specific for anyone to have bothered. But it feels like they're running running approximately 30%, because I've noticed your minimum hit odds thing basically just doesn't work if you run into an enemy with a stop proof on there. So, for example, if here, where are the enemy units, with a resist on there. So, like, if you have charm and you're using concentration, you would have 30% to hit, but you would have 0% to hit if you're targeting like this Fusilier right here, you know. So basically, this just counters concentration for the purpose of that particular debuff. So since the AI isn't casting them, you don't need them on yours, because the 2 times which actually it's funny, this actually informs a bit of a different thing right here, because it basically tells us that there is essentially a role being done when it comes to cockatrices and fairies. Cockatrices, fairies, and I believe the angels will still do. We'll still do theirs. I'm not 100% certain on that. But basically, Petrification and Charm are the ones that they will be using, which basically tells us that they have a certain percentage, which means that this probably does do a mind check in their particular case. Also probably might be what goes on with Virtuous Dance sometimes, because typically you will see some pretty insane mind on fairies. But anyways, so as far as all of that is concerned, yeah, it seems to be that those ones will essentially be running a check in their particular case. But either way, it seems like a 30% reduction in that particular check, but you aren't subject to the to checks from the other ones. So for example, when there's something like a howl, like in many of these automatic ones, having resist stun wouldn't necessarily help in this case, because they're going and it's just a flat chance for this to happen. So for automatic ones, it worked that way in PSP, it works this way in One Vision 2, but basically when they roll their automatic ability, the howl just has a set chance to happen. If it shoots out of the unit, it lands on whatever it's hitting. Or if there's a 100% hit chance, like for example a Dragon's Eye False Strike over here, then that still will just be a 100% chance. You aren't resisting that necessarily. Additionally, stuff like Breach, Slow, Weaken, pretty much anything with a red icon. I'm trying to think if there were any exceptions to the red icon thing. There might be. But either way, those ones are something that you can't resist, that there are no resistances at all. But basically, this just means that certain debuffs will just be less likely to hit certain units, which actually is interesting because it basically, if you're wondering why that's there, like from a design perspective, I was wondering that for the longest time too. And then it kind of occurred to me that many of the times when you're going back into these areas, it's basically, like I said earlier, effectively the reverse of something like concentration, where, you know, with concentration, if you don't have the stats to win that situation, you still have a minimum hit chance. In this particular case, it's just the reverse, where if you don't have the stats to withstand what they're bringing, you still have a chance to survive that situation. It's more so just a chance to survive more than anything else. So if you're coming in, like let's say in New Game Plus, you're super overpowered, you've gotten all of your, you know, your higher stats and whatever else, your units are yoked out of their dang mind, and you're going and you're going to hit this guy with something like a Sanctus Flare, there's a decent chance it'll still miss. Or there's a decent chance that that your Flaming Blast might miss, or that your Charm might miss. Just basically, it gives them the ability to survive certain things a little bit more some of the time. It gives a little bit more flavor to some of these randos that otherwise are basically just pushovers, you know. So either way, just wanted to kind of show that this was provably a design decision that was here, basically was there to make stuff faster. You'll note it, like, the thing that kind of made me question it for the longest time is, if I can find some right here, where you would see that that many casters will still carry their debuff abilities, and at first I thought they were just filling out bars, but then you see stuff like this, where certain units are clearly dedicated, just like offensive casters, they're not meant to have that particular thing. But then you start seeing those situations where, for example, certain wizards and stuff like that will be nearby you, and you'll notice later on in the game, once you start getting on into side areas and stuff, they'll be a bit more optimized. But you'll start noticing that pretty much when you're running into recruits and things, like units that you can actively go and recruit, they'll typically be the ones that end up carrying more debuffs with them, meaning that they seem to be there for the purpose of just pulling a reverse, where you just kind of roll in. You roll in. You quickly. Let's just back out of this one real quick, see if I can show what I'm talking about here. Where you go in, you recruit those units, and then you have immediate access to those particular things. And it seems oddly specific, but I know I've run into situations already where, for example, many of the wizards in Palace of the Dead will be running around with things like Paradigm Shift. And if you haven't, the store there doesn't carry Paradigm Shift, which means that a lot of these debuff spells that you may suddenly realize, oh crap, this is pretty useful, you might suddenly see like, oh shoot, that wizard over there is carrying it, I'm going to go recruit them, and there you go, you have access to it. So, like I said, a lot of these areas where they're clearly meant to just be swept aside, they're quickly replenishable areas like the temples, you'll notice that they're a bit more offensively orientated and stuff like that. So either way, pretty much top to bottom, this is one of those things that I really love design-wise about the remake, that clearly thought went into all of this stuff. And I mean, basically every version of Tactics Ogre, whenever it's come out, has always had that same thing of like, everything is a bug, everything's not working right. Like, so many years of the PSP version getting panned for random assumptions, like this is nothing new, but like, you see the vein in this dude's head, like, still every time I see an angry comment over stuff like negative review, I couldn't figure out how to install the game, it will immediately piss me off. I kid you not, there's at least 2 of those on Steam right now. Like, I really need to stop looking at the Steam reviews, it's irritating. Anyway, so that's about that. Y'all have yourselves a good one, and take care. Bye.